Some movies weren't just entertainment, they were warnings that authorities didn't want you to hear. Sci-fi, with its wild futures and dangerous ideas, has a long history of pushing boundaries so far that censors panicked. What happens when a movie feels a little too close to reality, or its message seems too rebellious for comfort? Buckle up. We're diving into 12 sci-fi classics that were banned, trimmed, or buried, yet only became stronger in legend. Metropolis, 1927. Imagine being in 1927, sitting in a theater as Fritz Lang's Metropolis unspooled its vision of towering skyscrapers, underground workers, and a future where class divisions were built into the city itself. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a political firecracker. American distributors hacked away at it, fearing that its bold critique of inequality would stir unrest during an era when labor strikes were already erupting. Even in its home country of Germany, the reaction was conflicted. Some praised its grand visuals, others bristled at its sympathy for the working class. The cuts were brutal. Nearly a third of the movie was erased for international audiences, stripping away huge parts of its story. What remained was still dazzling, but fractured, like watching a puzzle with missing pieces. The Nazi regime later tried to reshape the film's meaning, celebrating the visuals while rejecting its social commentary. For decades, audiences only saw incomplete versions, each one shifting its message depending on what had been sliced out. But here's where the story gets fascinating. The censorship didn't kill Metropolis, it made it mythic. People whispered about lost reels, about scenes too daring to survive. In 2008, when a nearly complete print surfaced in Argentina, fans finally saw what had been missing for more than 80 years, and suddenly, everything clicked. The politics, the vision, the ambition, it all felt ahead of its time. Metropolis became more than a movie. It was proof that even when governments tried to silence an idea, it could still echo across a century. Instead of being forgotten, the cuts made it immortal. Today, it's celebrated as one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made, precisely because it survived the scissors. King Kong, 1933. By the time King Kong stormed onto screens in 1933, audiences had never seen anything like it. A giant ape towering over New York, planes buzzing around him, and stop-motion effects that felt almost alive. For moviegoers, it was thrilling. For some governments, it was unacceptable. Nazi Germany outright banned it, claiming the imagery was too disturbing. Finland initially blocked it, only allowing a watered-down version. Even in the United States, later re-releases were trimmed. Censors went after the violence, screams cut short, falls erased, and fight scenes softened. Their reasoning? People during the Great Depression didn't need nightmares on top of their real-world struggles. But if anything, those cuts made the film more mysterious. Audiences started whispering about the lost scenes, imagining moments so terrifying they couldn't be shown. That buzz only fueled its reputation, turning Kong into more than a monster. It made him legend. The irony is, Kong wasn't just about spectacle. It was about fear and awe colliding on screen. Willis O'Brien's groundbreaking animation gave the creature soul, while the story itself tapped into primal anxieties, man versus nature, civilization versus the wild, the unstoppable versus the fragile. And the very things censors tried to hide were what gave the film its power. Instead of being diminished, King Kong's reputation grew every time someone tried to silence it. The bans and cuts didn't bury the movie, they amplified it. Decades later, Kong still stands tall, not just as a special effects milestone, but as proof that you can't cage a story that was built to roar. The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951. At first glance, it looked like a simple alien visitation story. But The Day the Earth Stood Still wasn't about little green men, it was about us. Klaatu, the calm visitor, arrives not to conquer, but to warn humanity. Stop your obsession with destruction or risk total annihilation. In the early 1950s, with Cold War tension at its peak, that message landed like a thunderclap. Censors weren't happy. Military leaders in the United States worried the film was pushing pacifist propaganda at a time when the arms race was climbing. In Spain, under Franco's regime, the film was sliced apart, its speeches hacked down to soften the anti-war message. Even in other parts of the world, theater owners were pressured not to screen it. The fear wasn't Klaatu's glowing robot Gort, it was the possibility that audiences might actually question the nuclear race. What makes the censorship fascinating is how it proved the movie's point. The day the Earth stood still wasn't wrapped in metaphor. It was blunt, urgent, and unflinching. And that bluntness terrified those invested in keeping the status quo. People weren't just watching a sci-fi flick. They were watching a mirror held up to the most dangerous instincts of their time. Over the years, the film grew into one of the defining classics of 1950s sci-fi. What censors once considered dangerous became iconic. Klaatu's message, simple yet piercing, turned into one of the most quoted warnings in cinema. And ironically, every attempt to water it down only gave it more authority. This wasn't just fiction, it was a cinematic plea for survival. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. A small-town doctor discovers his neighbors are being replaced by cold, emotionless doubles. That alone would be creepy enough, but Invasion of the Body Snatchers became a political grenade. Depending on who you asked, it was either a parable about communist infiltration or a jab at America's paranoia during the McCarthy era. That ambiguity made it unstoppable, and for censors, unbearable. In Eastern Europe, the movie was banned outright, branded as Western propaganda. In the United States, it triggered debates among critics, politicians, and audiences. Was it anti-communist, showing conformity as the ultimate horror? Or was it a quiet attack on American society's obsession with suspicion and witch hunts? The beauty of the film was that it worked either way. The pods could represent the loss of individuality under one system or the crushing fear under another. That dual meaning was what made it terrifying. You couldn't pin it down, and governments hate that. Censors wanted clean messages, not ones that forced people to ask dangerous questions. But despite bans and heated arguments, the movie found its audience. Word of mouth spread, and soon it was considered one of the most unsettling science fiction thrillers ever made. Remakes followed across decades, but none carried the same raw political edge as the original. The irony? The very act of trying to bury it proved its message. In a world where conformity is forced, resistance is the only thing that keeps individuality alive. The movie didn't just warn about pod people, it warned about us. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. When Stanley Kubrick unleashed A Clockwork Orange, the world wasn't ready. On the surface, it was a futuristic tale about youth gone wild in a dystopian Britain. Underneath, it was a jagged mirror reflecting society's darkest impulses. And that was the problem. It hit too close. In the United States, the film barely slipped into theaters with an X rating after cuts. Across the globe, the reaction was explosive. South Africa banned it entirely. Brazil pulled it from circulation. Singapore said no way. And in Britain, the backlash was so intense that Kubrick himself withdrew it from release after accusations it was influencing real-life violence. For decades, you couldn't legally watch it in the UK. What terrified authorities wasn't just the shocking behavior on screen. It was the questions buried inside. Can free will exist if governments control behavior? What does morality mean if it's programmed instead of chosen? Kubrick didn't offer clean answers. He forced viewers to stare into humanity's ugliest corners and sit with the discomfort. The result? Outrage, lawsuits, debates, and endless arguments about whether it was art or corruption. Fans went underground, hunting down bootleg copies just to see the film people were whispering about. And like so many movies on this list, the censorship only added fuel to its legend. Today, A Clockwork Orange isn't just remembered as a film, it's remembered as a cultural event. It became the ultimate proof that when art dares to go too far, it doesn't disappear. It becomes immortal, whether the censors like it or not. THX 11381971. Before George Lucas built his galaxy far, far away, he made something colder, quieter, and infinitely more disturbing. THX 1138 wasn't about space battles or heroic rebels. It was about a future where individuality had been erased. People had no names, only numbers. Emotions were outlawed. Every move was monitored by faceless authority. It wasn't escapism. It was a nightmare of silence. Audiences expecting adventure were stunned, and censors were rattled. In Europe, certain scenes were trimmed for being anti-establishment. In the United States, theaters slapped it with warnings about disturbing content, and some refused to screen it at all. The problem wasn't blood or explosions, it was the suffocating realism. Lucas leaned into long, sterile shots and endless white corridors, forcing viewers to feel the weight of control. In 1971, when protests against authority were everywhere, this didn't feel like science fiction. It felt like tomorrow's headline. At release, THX 1138 bombed. Viewers wanted escapism, not a bleak reminder that freedom can vanish with a signature. But censorship didn't bury it. It planted a seed. Over time, fans rediscovered it, realizing Lucas once painted a future that was far more chilling than Star Wars ever dreamed. The irony is rich. A movie that was rejected for being too heavy has aged into one of the sharpest visions of totalitarian control ever put on screen. Censors tried to strip its power, but all they did was confirm its message. Silence, as it turned out, can scream louder than explosions. Soylent Green, 1973. By the early 1970s, audiences had seen plenty of dystopias, but Soylent Green went further, and it left censors scrambling. Set in a grim future where the world is overcrowded, resources are gone, and corruption rules, it built toward one of the most shocking reveals in cinema history. The ending was so bleak that authorities in multiple countries declared the film destabilizing. In Mexico and across South America, governments banned it outright, arguing that its themes of overpopulation and corruption were too dangerous. In the Middle East, screenings were blocked, and even in the United States, critics debated whether it was simply too dark for audiences already facing economic and political turmoil. This wasn't entertainment designed to distract, it was a story designed to confront. What rattled people most wasn't a monster or alien, it was the mirror the film held up. Soylent Green insisted that humanity's biggest threat wasn't invaders from the sky, but greed, pollution, and the willingness to ignore a collapsing planet. And that hit too close to home. Of course, bans didn't make it disappear, they made it stronger. People who couldn't see it in theaters sought it out elsewhere. Over time, it became a cult classic, with its ending referenced endlessly in pop culture. And the more time passes, the more prophetic it feels. Environmental collapse, corporate power, climate change, it all reads like Soylent Green's script is still unfolding. Governments tried to silence its warning, but all they did was prove the film's point. Sometimes the scariest future is the one we're already building. Mad Max, 1979. What began as a scrappy Australian low-budget thriller exploded into one of cinema's wildest franchises. But when Mad Max first hit screens in 1979, not everyone was cheering. Censors across the globe slammed the brakes, claiming its brutal imagery was too much for audiences. New Zealand banned it outright, saying its chaos and violence were unacceptable. In Sweden, audiences only got to see a neutered, cut-down version. Even in Australia, where it was made, arguments erupted over whether it had crossed the line. Governments weren't just reacting to car crashes and on-screen mayhem, they were reacting to the message underneath. Mad Max dared to suggest something truly unsettling, that civilization was fragile, that one push, one collapse of order, could turn society into a wasteland where survival depended on speed, instinct, and nothing else. In the late 1970s, with rising crime rates and fears of unrest, that idea wasn't just entertainment, it was provocation. And of course, bans only poured gasoline on its legend. Bootleg VHS tapes spread across continents, whispered about at conventions and college dorms. Fans sought it out precisely because someone had tried to hide it. By the time its sequel, The Road Warrior, arrived, Mad Max had gone from outlaw movie to global phenomenon. The lesson: you can cut, censor, or ban, but if a story taps into something primal, it can't be stopped. Mad Max didn't just survive censorship, it burned rubber straight into film history. Planet of the Apes, 1968. When Planet of the Apes landed in 1968, audiences expected costumes, spectacle, and a bit of camp. What they got was one of the boldest sci-fi endings ever filmed. Charlton Heston, stumbling onto the shattered ruins of the Statue of Liberty, realizing humanity had destroyed itself. That single image was so provocative that it sent censors scrambling. In South Korea, the movie was banned outright, with officials claiming its portrayal of political collapse and nuclear devastation was unacceptable. Other countries criticized it for undermining traditional institutions, pointing to its sharp critiques of war, racism, and blind obedience. Even in the United States, some critics argued it was too dark, too cynical, for mainstream audiences in the middle of the Vietnam era. But beneath the ape masks and action sequences was a message governments couldn't control, a warning about humanity's arrogance and self-destruction. That ending didn't just shock audiences, it forced them to think about the world outside the theater, and that's exactly what censors feared. Of course, the bans and complaints backfired. Instead of hiding the movie, they fueled its reputation. Planet of the Apes became a box office phenomenon, launching sequels, reboots, and parodies that still echo through pop culture today. What was once considered too bleak is now remembered as one of sci-fi's greatest gut punches. Planet of the Apes proved that sometimes the most dangerous idea isn't aliens taking over, it's the realization that we might be our own worst enemy. Robocop, 1987. On paper, Robocop sounded like a pulpy action flick, a cop brought back to life as a cyborg in crime-ridden Detroit. In reality, it was a razor-sharp satire dripping with commentary about capitalism, corporate greed, and what happens when human life becomes disposable. But censors? They weren't laughing. The Motion Picture Association of America nearly slapped it with an X rating, forcing director Paul Verhoeven to cut multiple scenes just to sneak by with an R. The most infamous edits involved toning down the boardroom execution scene and a brutal attack early in the film. Even after the cuts, the movie pushed the limits of what audiences had ever seen in a mainstream sci-fi release. Internationally, countries hacked away at it too, trimming sequences that made the violence hit too hard. Critics were divided. Some saw it as clever satire, others dismissed it as nothing more than gore in a shiny metallic wrapper. But what the censors missed was the point. The violence wasn't meant to thrill, it was meant to unsettle. It mirrored a society where people were treated like products. Ironically, the more they cut, the sharper the legend became. Fans hunted down uncut versions on VHS, celebrating the movie not only as action, but as biting social critique. Robocop proved you could blend sci-fi, dark humor, and outrageous visuals into something unforgettable. Censors tried to dull its edge, but instead they made it iconic. Akira, 1988. When Akira burst onto the scene in 1988, it wasn't just another animated film. It was a cultural earthquake. Neon-soaked Tokyo, biker gangs tearing through the night, psychic powers tearing apart the city. This was animation like no one had seen before. For some governments, though, it was far too much. Russia banned it outright, declaring it harmful to young audiences. Across Europe, restrictions piled on, with certain graphic scenes trimmed before release. Even in America, early VHS copies were edited down, with whole sequences clipped to make it more acceptable. But here's the twist. Every time censors tried to shrink it, Akira only grew bigger. Bootlegs spread like wildfire, and fans whispered about the missing moments as if they were forbidden knowledge. Beyond the visuals, what rattled people was the story's depth. Government corruption, science spiraling out of control, youth rebellion boiling over. It was all there, wrapped in a fever dream of cyberpunk imagery. The film's raw power didn't just survive censorship, it thrived because of it. Today, Akira is hailed as one of the greatest animated films of all time, inspiring everything from The Matrix to Stranger Things. The attempts to silence it only made its legend louder. Sometimes the future can't be censored, it breaks through no matter how many edits are made. Battle Royale 2000. Long before the Hunger Games became a franchise, there was Battle Royale, a film so provocative that entire countries refused to touch it. The premise was simple but explosive. A group of students forced by their government to fight each other until only one survived. It was brutal, yes, but it was also pointed commentary on control, obedience, and what a system will do to maintain power. In the United States, distributors avoided it entirely, terrified of public backlash over its kids killing kids concept. In Britain, politicians debated whether it should ever be shown. Even in Japan, where it was made, the film sparked heated arguments among lawmakers and critics. For some countries, it was easier to ban it outright than deal with its implications. What scared censors wasn't just the battles, it was the message. Battle Royale suggested that society could become so desperate to suppress rebellion that it would turn on its own youth. That idea landed like a live wire in cultures already grappling with issues of control and freedom. Bootleg DVDs smuggled their way into dorm rooms and conventions, building a cult following across the globe. By the time mainstream audiences caught up years later, its reputation was already cemented as one of the most dangerous sci-fi thrillers of its era. Instead of being forgotten, Battle Royale became immortal. Its influence ripples through pop culture to this day, and the irony is delicious. The film that many tried to hide ended up becoming a blueprint for the genre. So, what's the real takeaway? Every time censors tried to slice, ban, or bury these movies, they only made them louder. The forbidden became legendary, the cut-down versions turned into underground treasures, and the warnings inside the stories echoed even harder. Which of these sci-fi movies do you think deserved freedom the most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and remember, you can't censor imagination.